All right, we're going to move on to item number 3 on the agenda. Below market rate BMR Residential Housing Mitigation and Commercial Linkage Fee Update for the Cupertino BMR Housing Program. Application number CP 20901. Applicant, City of Cupertino, location Citywide. So we have a staff report now.
Commissioners, while we're loading up the slideshow for you, tonight we have a couple consultants for us to present this item, as well as city staff. We have, well, I'll let the consultants introduce themselves. They can do a better job. But on the city staff side, we have Carrie Huesler, Housing Manager, as well as Eric Serrano, our housing staff, planning staff, here to answer some questions. So with that, I believe our slideshow is ready to go. Eric?
Carrie, did you want to start?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to let Carrie.
I'll add more to what Ben opened with. Good evening, Chair and Commissioners. My name is Carrie Huesler, Housing Manager for the city. We are here tonight to present a study session on the BMR Linkage Fee Update Study. This item is on the city's current work program and was presented to the Housing Commission on July 25th, where the Commission discussed various topics including different on-site BMR production requirements, different levels of affordability, and commercial linkage fees. This item will be presented to City Council in September as a study session item. I am joined tonight by my colleague Eric Serrano, Eric Phillips from Goldfarb Lippman, and Sujata Srivastava from Strategic Economics. And our team is here to provide you with a presentation and bring forth your recommendations to City Council for consideration. And so with that, we'd like our consultant team to introduce themselves as well and provide presentations, and we're all here to answer your questions this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introductions, Ben and Carrie, and good evening, commissioners. My name is Eric Phillips. I'm special counsel to the city from Goldfarb and Lippman. And as we start the study session, I'm just going to give a little bit of context for the city's existing BMR program and some of the legal parameters that can guide your discussion when you're thinking about recommendations that you ultimately want to make to City Council for their consideration. And then after I do my somewhat brief introductory remarks, Sujata will share more detailed results of the actual feasibility study that she and her firm prepared. But to start, I just wanted to give an idea of the background of the different city regulations that are implicated by this discussion. At the top level, the housing element identifies a minimum amount of affordable housing that is required to be produced in connection with market rate housing. The city, to implement the housing element strategy, has adopted a below market rate housing ordinance, which implements the housing element requirements and authorizes the creation of specific rules and regulations that the city has adopted, and that's in the form of its housing mitigation manual. And the housing mitigation manual is the document that includes the most detailed commitments from the city and direction to project applicants about what they have to provide in order to meet the city's requirements with respect to affordable housing production. And what that says is that for new residential development with 7 or more units, 15% of the total units that are developed must be reserved at below market rate prices. And for ownership units, the city's current requirement is that 50% of the affordable units be for median income households and 50% be for moderate. For rental units, it's 60% reserved for very low income and 40% reserved for low income, and that's 60% of the 15% and 50% of the 15%. To give a little context for what that actually means, we look to the State Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, annually publishes income limits that correspond with those different income categories. For example, very low income corresponds to approximately 50% of the area median income, and in 2019, that equates to an income of a little bit over $73,000 per year for a 4-person household. We've seen actually, as won't surprise any of you, we've seen a pretty rapid increase in the household income limits over the last few years as a result of the rapidly rising area median income. And all of these affordability categories are pegged to that figure. In addition to the on-site production requirements that I just discussed, the city also has 2 types of mitigation fees. In 2015, the city prepared both a Nexus Study and a Feasibility Study, and used the information from that study to set mitigation fees for housing. So for projects that are 6 units or below, instead of producing units, they pay the fees that are shown here on the slide. For commercial projects, there's also linkage fees. Office, hotel, and retail projects are all required to pay a fee to offset their impact on the demand for affordable housing that new development creates. So as you're thinking about how these policies work in the city and what outcomes you'd like to encourage, there's a couple of key legal parameters that I wanted to make sure we were all aware of. The first is a Supreme Court case, a California Supreme Court case from 2015. It was the California Building Industry Association versus the City of San Jose, and there the BIA challenged the city's inclusionary housing requirements and said that they were either an unconstitutional taking or they needed to be justified through a Nexus study, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. But the Supreme Court rejected those arguments. They said that price controls on new residential properties are part of the city's police power, as long as the requirements are reasonably related to the health, safety, and welfare of the public. You can adopt them without a Nexus study. However, there's an important limitation on how high they can be set. In order to avoid creating a taking, the price controls that the city imposes have to leave the opportunity for a fair return to property owners. And that's part of why the economic work that Sujata is going to talk about is so important, because having an economically feasible development is one way to demonstrate that you have that fair return opportunity, that you're not precluding a property owner from using their property. Another key element for you to consider is AB 1505. This was a state law that was adopted in 2017 that explicitly permitted cities and counties to impose inclusionary requirements on rental housing. There had been case law that was in place previous to 2017 that prohibited the city from enforcing its rental BMR requirements. But the state overturned that case and changed the law and reauthorized the city to require on-site affordable housing. However, it put a couple of key limitations on your ability to do that in order to make sure that the requirements are not used to suppress housing production in general. The first is that there's a safe harbor of 15%. The city's current on-site production requirements comply. No more than 15% of a project is required to be affordable. If you require more than 15%, then HCD, under certain circumstances, can ask that the city prepare an economic feasibility study to demonstrate that the affordability requirements don't suppress all residential development. And again, the work that Sujata will talk about, if I ever let her, will help demonstrate that and show that what recommendations are that would allow feasible residential development, even if it exceeds above 15% in certain circumstances. The other requirement is that there have to be alternatives to on-site compliance. It doesn't say that you have to give the option of feeing out, but you do have to give some other way of complying, either off-site production, donation of land, acquisition and rehab. The city's current ordinance has these alternatives and complies but it's something that you might want to consider as you're having your discussion on the topic tonight. And then looking at the non-residential projects and that commercial linkage fee, the city is allowed to impose impact fees on commercial development for affordable housing. However, there has to be a nexus between the fee amount and the actual need that's created for affordable housing by the non-residential development. So the 2015 Nexus Study that the city had prepared satisfies that requirement and sets I would say, a theoretical maximum amount that shows the nexus that exists between the development of new office and the need for affordable housing within the community. However, it's very rare to see a city actually set its linkage fees at the ultimate ceiling that's allowed under a Nexus study, because that's not the only legal standard that applies. Again, that the concept of feasibility is important to make sure that we don't wipe out the underlying value of property. We don't want to accidentally create a regulatory taking by having requirements that makes development of properties infeasible. So we have the 2015 Nexus study, which gives us some cover for the ultimate ceiling. And then again, the results that Sujata is about to share with you will show the current conditions and economic feasibility associated with potentially changing the impact fees from the levels that the city currently has in place. So I am going to pass the mic.
Thanks, Eric. Good evening, commissioners. I'm Sujata Srivastava. I'm a principal at Strategic Economics, and we did the economic feasibility study. So I think Eric already described this very well, so not to belabor the point about the Nexus study, but the methodology is essentially just relating new commercial space to the demand for housing for the workers in those industries. And similarly, that's the methodology for the residential side as well. And if you have questions about those linkages, we can definitely answer those. However, I just wanted to kind of work more of the presentation on the economic feasibility study that we conducted. The key questions that we were addressing were, on the residential side, how would increasing the inclusionary requirements beyond 15% or increasing the affordable housing mitigation fees affect whether a project would be feasible, how would it affect the bottom line? And there were also questions about including extremely low-income housing units in rental projects as part of that increase, which we also tested and examined, and as well as the potential for including median income and moderate income units in rental projects over and beyond the 15%. On the non-residential side, it was just really looking at increases in the linkage fees for all of the commercial products that we were looking at, which were office and R&D, hotel and retail developments. And those are based on the Nexus study. So for those that are not familiar with the feasibility analysis, it's a type of analysis that's used very frequently by cities to look at the impact of a certain type of policy change. So any kind of land use change, zoning and other requirements, new impact fees. And it analyzes the costs of a development project in comparison to the revenues that are generated from the project. So you're essentially just looking at whether the returns to an investor, a developer, would be sufficient. There are some limitations to this type of analysis. One of them is that we're looking at prototypical development that is intended to represent the type of projects that are likely to happen in Cupertino, but of course there are always some slight variations from project to project. So there might be some slightly different results under different conditions. So we're trying to model kind of the most common type of case, but that's not gonna represent every outlier. The other thing is that it's like any kind of modeling exercise, it's pretty sensitive to the assumptions that you make about construction costs currently, what the land prices are at this moment, what the rents and sales prices are. And if these conditions were to change over time, as market cycles do shift over time, the results could also vary. So that's just important context for you as you're looking at the results. The steps to the analysis are, the first step is, as I mentioned before, developing the prototypes that symbolize the type of development that's most likely to happen. So, what's the density of the project? What are the unit types for residential? Or what's the FAR for non-residential? Those kinds of assumptions about what's the building type going to be, because that informs how you think about development costs and revenues. And then we collect information about land costs, construction costs, soft costs, financing, other city fees, and permits. And then we also look at the values in the market based on current rents and sales prices. And the next step then is to build an Excel-based model, a pro forma model that measures the values and revenues. We used a metric called return on cost and yield on cost, which basically looks at the revenues or value of a project in relationship to the development costs. And that ratio, it's a slightly different metric for sale product than it is for rental product or for commercial product. So if you want to know more about that, I can answer that later too. But these are pretty typical metrics in the industry. So to start with the residential BMR program and share those results, the first step, again, I already talked about this, but we used the prototypes from the 2015 Nexus Study as a starting point. We made some adjustments to that, but they represent the residential and mixed-use product types that we think would be subject to the BMR policy. We also worked closely with city staff to look at what the assumptions should be about the income targets and the affordable sales prices and rents that Eric shared with you. And we collected all those inputs based on a variety of different sources. Some of them are publications and proprietary sources like CoStar and Redfin. And some of them were actually just talking to developers in the Silicon Valley region that are pursuing projects right now to get their input on what the costs and revenues are for development projects. And we also reviewed, we're working on a lot of other similar analyses in a lot of neighboring cities, so we also reviewed some of those factors that we're using in similar cities. Then we tallied up all the costs, subtracted them from the project value to calculate the value, and as I said, we looked at that ratio to calculate the return. And then we compare that to a metric to determine whether something is feasible or not. So there's kind of a floor at which something would be considered attractive enough for an investor or a developer to pursue. Developers are dependent on a lot of outside capital sources and investors to make a project work. And so we look at these types of metrics as an indicator of whether a project is likely to secure financing and move forward or not. So this table just describes the characteristics of the prototypes. There were essentially, on the residential side, there were 5 prototypes. The first is a detached single-family project. The second is a small lot single-family / townhouse project. The third is a mixed-use condominium project, and prototype 4 is lower density rental, and then prototype 5 is higher density rental. So the lower density is about 35 dwelling units per acre, and the higher density is about 76 dwelling units per acre. There are very limited locations in Cupertino where you would be able to do that type of development project, but we thought it would be important to look at this higher density prototype as well. That was in the Nexus study. And as you can see here, there are a lot of assumptions about the parking, what the current requirements are, and then for the higher density, the condominium, lower density rental apartments, and higher density rental apartments, so the multifamily products, we did look at some reductions in parking as part of our analysis to see what that would do for the financial feasibility of the project. And we can talk about that a little bit later too, if you have questions. So on the BMR requirement for ownership products, so this is again the single family detached, small lot single family, and condominiums, we found that there was potential, it would be economically feasible to to have an inclusionary rate of 20%. So the green color here shows what would be feasible, and the red is showing what is not feasible. So the return on cost, so the type of return that you would get on a project is sufficient at 20%, but not at 25%. It also would be feasible for those types of projects to have the alternative of paying the mitigation fees in lieu of developing the units on site. On the rental side, we also looked at the inclusionary requirements at 20% and 25% and found that it would not be feasible under current market conditions to increase the inclusionary from its current rate to these higher inclusionary rates. And that has a lot to do with just the cost of development right now in the Bay Area, and the rents are not quite at a point where they can offset those development costs. On the higher density rental, we did find that it would be financially feasible to do the fees as an alternative. And then we also looked at BMR programs in peer cities just to try to get an understanding of where other cities are on their inclusionary requirements, what their target incomes are, and what their policies are regarding fees versus on-site units. I should say that some of this is kind of a moving target because a lot of cities are reassessing their requirements right now. But at the moment, you can see that the most cities are in that 15% range. So for the non-residential linkage fee, the analysis was quite similar, developing prototypes. Our office and R&D prototype was assuming a Class A speculative office building, so not necessarily built for a specific corporate tenant, but something that would be a multi-tenant office building. The hotel was assumed to be a select service, upscale business serving hotel, and then the retail was just a very small neighborhood shopping center. So our findings on the R&D and office were that currently the current linkage fee is a little under $24 per square foot, that it could be raised to 25 and almost to 30. It was just slightly, we had set a threshold of 6% for something to be considered feasible, and the results for scenario 3, which is a $30 fee, is at 5.99%. So we would say somewhere between 25 to 30 is within the feasibility range, but maybe not quite at 30. And then on the hotel feasibility, our results were that you could increase slightly over the current fee of about $12 to maybe a little bit under $15, which is where it starts to kind of become a little bit less feasible. And then retail, we did not find that retail was feasible even without the inclusion of the linkage fees, just because of the relationship of land values, construction costs, and rents. I think that a lot of the development activity in the area shows that most retail is likely to be in a mixed-use format where the office or residential kind of helps make that retail possible. So some of our residential prototypes have a mixed-use format, and we did find that condos with a retail component could support that increased inclusionary, and in addition to the linkage fee on the retail component of the mixed-use product. So just retail as a standalone, we did not find to be feasible. Again, we looked at linkage fees in peer cities. This is mostly San Mateo and Santa Clara counties, as well as San Francisco, and found that for the most part, fees they do vary a bit depending on the product type. So for office, they tend to be in the $15 to $25 range. There are some cities that exceed that level. For hotel and retail, often cities have a slightly lower linkage fee level. That's partly due to other policy considerations and goals that they may have regarding those types of uses, and as well as feasibility results. So to conclude, our key takeaways on, what this might mean for policies and the key questions that we were asked to answer. The residential BMR, we found that ownership units could support an increase of 20% to 20%. You could also potentially increase the mitigation fees on those product types. But for rental, we did not find that it would be feasible to increase above 15%. In fact, any amount of inclusionary units can be challenging for rental products. And none of them would justify an on-site requirement of 25%. So for most of the product types, we found that you could increase the mitigation fees if that were available as an alternative. On the non-residential side, we found that office and R&D linkage fees could increase slightly to maybe close to $30, and hotel an increase to $15, maybe a little bit lower than $15. And for standalone, again, not feasible as a standalone, so we did not recommend an increase for that particular use, and found that as long as it's developed in conjunction with other types of uses, that the current linkage fee level still works for feasibility. So there's a lot. I have other additional slides on very specific numbers, but I'm going to stop there, and if you do have questions, we can use them as a reference. Thank you.
Do we have any more presentations? Or are we done? Okay, thank you. Now we open for deliberations by the commission. I know all of you have been furiously taking questions, so you want to start? Commissioner Khan?
Well, I started last time, so maybe somebody else will go first.
All right, Commissioner Takahashi?
Yeah, I don't have too many questions. One of the comments was that if the fees be reasonable. So who defines reasonable in this particular case? How do we define reasonable?
Yeah, it can be a challenge, and it comes up in litigation all the time. So, well,
Yeah.
who is this reasonable
Right.
person? I'd like to meet him or her.
And does that scale with the size of the project, for example?
Yeah, so in this context, it has a couple of specific meanings. When the reasonable relationship is demonstrated for the non-residential commercial linkage fees, the reasonable
Right.
relationship is established by the Nexus Study. So the Nexus Study will show, using the methodology that was outlined, it will show the relationship between the amount of new workers that are attracted by a new commercial use, what they're paid, what housing costs, what they can then afford to spend on housing, and how that impacts the demand for affordable housing. So then that creates the relationship between the new development and the impact on affordable housing. And that then Nexus Study can be used as a proxy to show that there's a reasonable relationship. That doesn't necessarily mean that the fee itself would be reasonable if you went all the way to the ceiling of the Nexus.
Right.
That's where the feasibility work comes in to make sure that a fee is not set so high that it acts as a way of prohibiting development altogether.
Okay. So, and so essentially, the basic premise is these fees are collected into a BMR fund, and then that's utilized to fund BMR projects. So in a area where there's not a lot of land, and how do we measure our success rate in actually tying back our efforts to actually, in terms of the number of BMR units versus, this office came in and brought in X number of dollars. Ideally, and through the Nexus, you kind of figure out, well, it's this many BMR units, but there's never actually, it's the project's done, the project's built, things move on. There's never really those funds were actually used and we got 1 unit, right? Or something like that. I guess that's just part of the process.
Yeah, so, and staff can go over specific numbers and figures, but it's that in general, So when what you just described, I think, is one advantage of having an on-site requirement for residential development, because
Right,
you see the units
exactly.
get produced in connection with the residential project. In the non-residential context, you can only require fees. They're not
Right,
building
right.
housing. And that is the main contributor to the city's BMR housing fund. Most of the funds in there do come from the city's non-residential projects. I think it was, I was talking with Carrie earlier today, they just had the grand opening this week for the Veranda project. That
Yeah.
was funded substantially with money that came directly from the BMR housing fund that was collected from that non-residential development, and as a result of those fees. But it is, as you pointed out, quite expensive to acquire land in this area. So it does take quite a big public contribution and a large pot of money to invest in it, getting a significant return on those units.
Right. So therein lies kind of the dilemma for the city, is if you truly scoped those fees relative to the cost of developing BMR housing, you'd essentially probably create a climate that would be very difficult, or developers would look to build office in adjacent cities like San Jose, for example, would be kind of an outcome, if you will, or that's a challenge, I guess, finding that balance of what can we collect versus, okay. Then we already talked about the fact, the question I had was, is maximum reasonable? And I think you've tried to address that through the feasibility elements, right? And you guys did a good job in terms of the comparison. So it looks like our fees are relatively consistent with a lot of other municipalities. Let's see, what does the percentage reflect on in lieu fees? I don't even know what that question, I can't remember. So that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Takahashi. Commissioner Moore.
So I worked out some math, kind of building on what Commissioner Takahashi was talking about, and how our fees could end up prohibitive, and I'd like to put something on the overhead. Okay, well, this wasn't intended to shock, but it might. So I did a sample office project and assumed you had 1,000 employees. And I used the 1 employee per 300 square foot metric. So I ended up with a 300,000 square foot office development, and assumed that Cupertino was going to house their workers, but the mitigation fees are just for the affordable need. And our general plan requires 15% affordable units, so I ended up with 150 below market rate units. Assuming we build at the lower cost, 600,000 per unit BMR, and the Veranda, which you mentioned, those were, I was told, around 800,000 per unit. So your mitigations end up being $90 million for those 150 BMR units, or 120 million if it's at 800,000 per unit, and then you end up with a mitigation fee of around $300 per square foot versus what we're looking at, which is in the 20s. And I omitted other issues that you actually have, and that one, the office employees may be in spaces as small as 150 square feet. So you're going to end up with a lot more than 1,000, and then you'll end up with more BMRs than 150, which I have in this example. And that each higher salary office employee creates a 4 to 7 support employee housing need with lower income jobs, and that's not being considered in this calculation either. And then, after doing this exercise, I then wondered if our 15% affordable requirement that we have in our general plan, if that's even realistic, and isn't the need actually something more like 400% for each office employee? So anyway, I worked this math, and it was shocking to me. So I'm done looking at the overhead part. I do have a question regarding the yield on cost, which in the report, it seemed as though the yield on cost for residential was assumed somewhere between 4 and 5, and then I'm seeing higher yield on costs for hotel and then for office, and I'd like to, have some education about that. And then for your Class A office example, you used 260,000 square feet, and I was wondering what happens if you're looking at 500,000 square feet or 2 million square feet. What then happens with the feasibility there?
So let me start with the question about the yield on cost. The way that we actually looked at the minimum required yield on cost was we actually pegged it to the capitalization rate. So this is a metric that represents the relationship between net operating income and project value. So it's net operating income divided by project value. In the Bay Area, cap rates for, and actually in the Silicon Valley, the cap rates for rental housing are very low right now, which is an indication that it's a very attractive place to invest. And so and it's a very secure type of investment because of the strong demand for rental housing. So you have a lower cap rate for rental residential, which is right now 4.25%. And we want to create a little bit of room between that cap rate and a required return, because that's the way that investors usually look at it. In fact, when you talk to developers, they'll say we need 1% over the cap rate often. We compressed that a little bit, so we did 0.5 to 1% as a buffer for them to. That's really kind of a way for them to think about the cost of capital relative to their return. It's a way for them to think about, if I were to sell this building now, what am I likely to get as an investor? So that's how we peg that. And cap rates for office are also fairly low. They're let me see. I think we used. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction. So for office, we assumed a cap rate of between 5 or 5.25%, and the yield on cost there that we used as a minimum was 6%. Now there were some developers who would like a slightly higher return than that, but we felt like this was a reasonable threshold given where current capitalization rates are. Now I'm trying to remember. Oh, your second question was about a larger office building and what the results would be. The way that our pro forma is built, there might be some slight changes depending on how high the building would be, what the FAR would be, and how it would fit on a site, and whether there would be some efficiencies to doing a bigger project. But for the most part, because we would assume probably the same floor area ratio and similar parking ratios, I think it would probably scale according to how big the building is, because the site would just need to be bigger to accommodate that. So if you're using FAR as your metric, it sort of is proportional to that. So if you doubled the project size, you would double the cost, you'd double the revenues. It kind of comes out even using this type of methodology. If you were to sort of change other types of assumptions about, putting less parking in the building or other types of standards, then that might change the results more significantly.
So if we were to take the office project mitigation and start heading towards this $300 per square foot mitigation, which I worked up, so what's the stop?
It's before you get to 300. So the Nexus Study that looks at the cap used a different methodology than what you just presented. So one way to look at it would be if it took the 1,000 workers that were in your hypothetical, the way the Nexus Study quantifies the demand is it looks at what the estimated salaries of those 1,000 workers would be. So that would account for both the higher income C-suite executives all the way down to the support staff, the janitors, clerical, the whole range within that 1,000 is accounted for in the Nexus Study. Then they look at the individual employee ability to acquire housing, and those that can't, what the gap is, what the affordability gap is that's created by the employees that would be very low income, median, and moderate. Then that affordability gap is attributed to the project. That's the demand for affordable housing that the project has created, and netted out over a per square foot basis. The Nexus study concluded that right around $129 per square foot was the absolute maximum for office, R&D, and industrial development. There's a greater demand for retail and restaurant because the employees tend to get paid less. So there, the theoretical maximum goes all the way up to $222. And in hotels, there's fewer employees, even though they do tend to be lower paid, but the per square foot cost there ends up being $49 per square foot. And again, that's the Nexus, that's the maximum that the Nexus shows that an individual project is creating for the demand of affordable housing. It's different than that, even though it's a theoretical maximum, it's different than the feasible maximum, which I think is a better guide to, again, make sure that we're not creating a regulatory taking or otherwise wiping out the underlying land value of a project.
Thank you. So were the 4 to 7 support employees considered in that the 1,000 or not?
Yes. So that's this, by support employees you mean like a janitor or other people in the.
Right. They talk about the direct employees, and then you have the indirect.
Oh, as well as their
employees.
spending and their.
Right. So you've got your direct employment, and then you've got, you'll see different ranges, but it's 4 to 7 indirect jobs will be created along with your one office employee.
Yeah, in some way that refers to the jobs created in retail, restaurants, and other things to support the people there.
Yes. Yeah. So that is incorporated within the Nexus methodology as well.
Those would be separate. So if you had retail, that's going to be on its own, and get mitigated. Correct?
Yes.
Right. And so then, if you're imposing a fee on a new retail project, that's paying its way. You want to make sure that we're not double counting within. So I don't know. Actually, do you want to explain the methodology? Because you'll do a better job than I will.
Commissioner, yeah, you're right. It's really looking at direct employment associated with each of these land uses on the non-residential side. On the residential side, it's actually doing the more indirect connections that you were describing. So for a residential nexus, it's looking at the household spending that's associated with a new unit and translating that into those retail service jobs, teachers, government employees, everything that goes along with a household. That's the more indirect on the housing side. So on the non-residential side, it is the direct employees in the building. But if you are going to impose a fee on office, and also a fee on retail, and also a fee on hotel, it becomes difficult to isolate those impacts when you do the multiplier effects throughout the economy, throughout the region. And so that's the reason why, using a more conservative methodology, it would be difficult for you to say this retail worker is associated with this office building and not that office building. So that's the reason for that. I hope that clarifies.
If I could just comment on that. The number that I think is being referred to here is something, it's based on a study by Professor Cal Moretti. Yeah, the Moretti study. So I think it's, and this is commented in, out in the world as well, that this is often misinterpreted. If somebody comes to live in an area or work in a building, somebody will cut their hair. And that would be the 4 to 7 jobs are the people who cut your hair and the people who work in a restaurant. However, those are not created on a one-to-one. The guy who cuts your hair doesn't just cut your hair, right? So the multiplier is actually small rather than large.
So I was wondering, how close, so we have these theoretical maximums, so it's 129 for office, 49 for hotel, if I've got that right, and then the 222 was for
That's retail and
That's-
restaurant.
retail restaurant. Okay, so how close can we get to these theoretical maximums without getting into the takings territory?
Staying within the feasibility range is the safest place to be. To show that development remains feasible without, once the city's fees have been incorporated, leaves you in the safest ground, because then we can show that the property still has underlying economic value. We're not wiping out the ability for somebody to use their property by imposing this regulation.
Going back to the residential, it seemed that for the ownership, that there was a area where you could go to the 25%. I think it was if it was condominium or townhouse. And if I understood correctly, if you go to the 20 and then also consider going to the 25%, you would need to have a feasibility study for HCD. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's correct. If you exceed 15%, then HCD has the ability to request that you provide a feasibility study that shows that market rate development remains feasible, notwithstanding the inclusionary requirements.
Okay, this isn't the chart that I'm thinking of. There was one where you had the 20 and 25, and it looked like townhouse and condominiums could go to that rate. So this is ownership. Could I see the rental one again, please? No, because this is showing
maybe different
infeasible.
The one that they, it was actually in your report. There's a table that basically it showed that the three rental prototypes, or the three ownership prototypes, could all tolerate a higher affordable rate, inclusionary rate, and that the two rental models could not.
Yeah, and so that's consistent with what this is showing, that 20% is increasing to 20% on the ownership prototypes would be feasible.
Same with this one.
Yeah, yeah.
Does that show 25?
That's just 1 to
20.
25.
None were good at 25.
No, there was one good.
None were viable at 25.
Table 3. Yeah.
Yeah, so looking at the staff report at 25%, all of the prototypes were shown as currently infeasible, which is also consistent with what's being reported on the slide here.
Okay, so. All right, so again, if we go to the 20, we would need to have a report submitted to HCD. That's the process for doing that.
So you could increase it to, the city could increase it to 20% if HCD then saw that the city wasn't keeping up with its above market rate housing production on its APR, which the city reports annually. HCD would then ask the city for a feasibility study to demonstrate that the reason that you're not keeping up with your above moderate housing isn't because of this new 20% or 25% affordability requirement that you've imposed. But the benefit of having the report that has already been prepared is that we do have justification for a 20% inclusionary requirement on those three ownership types. We have a report that shows that increasing to that level would be feasible.
Would HCD treat the study that was done for this exercise as compliant, as meeting that requirement?
Yeah, so the statute is pretty broad. It doesn't define the exact methodology, but certainly this study is robust and rigorous, and I would be very surprised if it was not accepted by HCD.
Commissioner.
To follow up on this, just so it's very clear, what HCD is looking for is the city trying to actually limit housing by imposing unreasonable BMR requirements such that they become infeasible and therefore none of the housing actually gets built, correct?
Yeah, and it could be an unintentional, it doesn't have to
Right,
be that
right.
they're
Could
trying
be-
to,
could
but
be an unintended
intentionally or otherwise, that a requirement is so high that it makes development of any housing
Right,
infeasible.
right, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. So
Fine.
let me try asking. So I found this report to really be fascinating. Of course, it's very timely. So one of the questions I have is, let's see, in the document on page 24, you don't need to flip there. This is the discussion around. Well, there was actually verbiage in it that said, lower density mixed use of prototypes can feasibly provide up to 15% exclusionary BMR if it could command 15% higher revenues, or if construction and land costs were reduced by 15%. I found that to be a kind of unusual statement. Is it a reasonable interpretation that the inclusionary rate, the current inclusionary rate on low density apartments, is too high?
So I don't know if I can make that judgment exactly, but what we did find was that using current construction costs and rents, we were not able to show that the lower density rental prototypes were achieving that return that we have set as a minimum. That said, that's today's land costs and construction costs and rents, so it's possible. That's one of the reasons we did the sensitivity analysis, is because we know that there are certain types of projects where perhaps someone acquired the land a long time ago at a different cost. There are a lot of variations in construction bids. Right now, there's a major labor shortage, particularly in specialized trades, which is driving up construction costs for certain types of products. So because of all of those variabilities, we thought it would be good to just show how sensitive the results might be based on those conditions.
So I'll just say that when we get around to actually deliberation, I think that there's value in actually. So I believe that this report actually showed for 3 classes, for low density apartments, high density apartments, and then really for retail, where retail, even if you completely remove the inclusionary requirement, it still is not feasible. So I think, those are all things where there is value in going back and looking at that as to whether that's something that should come to council's consideration. I think, in addition to that, I don't know whether this is something that would normally be done, from a professional standard, this would normally be done, but I think there's actually value, because you're doing a sensitivity analysis like this, to actually kind of seek zero. I think anybody looking at this would kind of say, if 15 is okay and 20 is not, then I think everybody will want to have will ask that question, under these conditions, are we talking 18 and a half here? And I think that, again, that's something that's not here, and I think that actually would be pretty valuable in terms of how people might think about what this means. And, I think in particular with the understanding that, that there are many variables here. And, it's interesting, one of the projects that's entitled and approved in town is exactly that. It is a project which has, it's a longtime owner who is redeveloping. So their model is different. One area that I'm curious about, you addressed it in the report, but it's a little bit masked by the infeasibility of some of the current, of rental. We've had a number of projects here where, locally, the Hamptons project and the Valco specific plan, the Valco specific plan Tier 2 specifically included a different kind of mix that was intended to improve the profitability. And that different mix was to add moderate into the allocation. So in some respects, you address that in the report because the feasibility was marginal already with the existing rental mix. But I think that this is an area that I would really strongly encourage to look at. I think that one of the things that's important is that, the question is, what are the things that, under what circumstances might you consider 20%? I think that the answer that I would take from this is that adding moderate into that mix, and that mix that we had was 9, 6, 9 very low, 6 low, and 5% moderate, that wasn't going to get you to 20%, even though that's what the specific plan had called for. So I think that I would definitely go back. I think that it would also be valuable to go back and look at a mix that included median and moderate, but only went to 15%, to see whether that was, is that better or worse or, equal. In particular, because the reason that the discussion of moderate housing comes up is because it serves a different portion of the community which there has been interest in serving. So this is the teachers, teachers, first responders, public officials, municipal employees. So one of the things that you can't take away from this report, which I think, which is actually living in your spreadsheet, is, what other kinds of mixes could be done, and whether that's usable. Now, one of the SV at Home has been a proponent of having moderate, a moderate component in the mix, and they would actually even higher than 5% to make these projects viable with a higher amount of affordable housing in it. And so it's possible that maybe their math doesn't work out either, but I think that that's a question that's definitely worth asking in the context of this study. And then in this study, the scenarios with both scenarios, rental included a retail component, and I think it's safe to guess from retail not being feasible on its own, that is probably a net negative on the revenue, or the return of these projects. So again, I would just say I think there's a scenario that's definitely worth looking at, which is like low density residential, low density rental only, and that would be it's illustrative how that compares to one that is mixed use. I'm curious. So, a lot of the studies we've had here were looking at residual value rather than return on cost, and that was actually the comment from the peer review. I'm curious, can you speak to the volatility of return on cost versus yield on cost? Are they similar or different?
Return on cost versus yield
the
on
volatility
cost?
of those numbers, yeah.
Well, they do fluctuate with market conditions, if that's what you mean, as do all these other metrics. I think that, and as does residual land value. One of the reasons why many consultants use yield on cost and return on cost is because it allows you, well, first of all, I think that we did actually have pretty good information on land values in this community, so we felt fairly comfortable with our assumptions on that. Although, obviously that also can vary. But we like yield on cost and return on cost because it allows you to establish a threshold at which we think that something is reasonable, as I explained before, by comparing it to capitalization rates and other types of investment opportunities. I think it's, in some ways, something that's clearer and allows you to kind of say, this is a go, no-go decision for a developer or an investor. Whereas the residual land value metric, as a result, can be a little bit less clear because you can always say, well, maybe that landowner might sell that site for that amount. So I think there's more ambiguity with that metric.
I would agree. Residual is difficult because it seems like it's missing a time value or something, and that's something that you do have here. The thing that would concern me as I was thinking about this was that, if I had a building, how do I want to say this? If I were, the yield on cost seemed like it had a high potential to be volatile because if if this is a retail calculation or a rental calculation, a vacancy has it has a qualitatively different effect on this metric versus if I were talking about what would I sell the building for. I mean, then it's, I don't know whether that's something that maybe that's factored into the.
Yeah, I mean, if you have vacancies, even the sale price of the building will be different because, so they are related in some way.
Yeah.
Right, so yield on cost is net operating income, so it does net out vacancy and operating expenses. So if you do have, those kinds of ups and downs in the cycle, then the yield on cost would respond to that. What I like about yield on cost is cap rates are published on a quarterly or semi-annual basis, so you can do that indexing on a regular basis. So someone could update the results of this study and compare them to, in 2020, to whatever current cap rates are at that moment in time.
Yeah, I think I will second that. The ability to compare against other investment options is very important because that's what establishes a baseline. And even comparing yield, like vacancies. So if the economy is down and you have more vacancies, chances are the interest rates are going to be much lower. So if you're investing, you're going to be comparing against a safe investment like a 10-year bond and say, I want to have like a 3% more or 2% more return on what a 10-year bond is. So it captures all those aspects which investor who's just looking at 5 different options and comparing them can compare. So
from my standpoint, it's really a, without being a professional in the business, is this an apples versus oranges thing, or is it apples and apples? So, I understand. I was curious too about some of these. I just had a note. See, on page 30, there was a comment about, I believe it is regular practice that parkland dedication fees are waived for affordable units. That isn't actually explicit in the current building code. I think that's treated as an option. I could be wrong. You guys will know that one. But it looks to me like there's a choice as to whether affordable units are subject to the inclusionary fee.
Yes, I believe they are waived. For affordable units are waived for the inclusionary housing because they are providing the affordable units.
Yeah, I mean, so the interesting thing is I'm not sure. I mean, that looks like it's ambiguous to me it's ambiguous in the municipal code.
It might be referenced in one of our other planning documents.
And then there were a couple things where, again, I think this was picked up. There were a couple things like the cost of land per acre and the parking cost per space. These numbers are lower than what we traditionally see. Were these just reflective of the comparables that you looked at?
So yeah, the land values, those were based on interviews with developers to sort of get a little bit of an understanding of what they, these product types are a little bit different. So we had a lower land value for the single family than we did for the other product types. And then
the one that's really notable is that the one that was used in the prototype for retail had, 6 million or something. It was much, much lower than the rest of them, if I remember correctly.
The land, oh, right,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
So part of the assumption is, and, this is a little bit of a judgment. It's not really it's not a hard and fast rule, but often when you speak to people in the industry, they will sometimes quote you values per FAR. So the way that a developer might look at a site and its potential value, the sales price, what they're willing to pay for it, depends on what they can do with the land. So if the base FAR is set at 0.3 or 0.4, and really all they can build on it is a very low density building, they're not going to pay what they would pay to be able to do a 2.0 FAR office building, right? So that's basically, it's just a way of saying the value of the land is really about what you can do with it.
So do you mean to say the zoning, what is this zone for, whether it's zoned for an office or a home or a retail, will affect the value?
Absolutely, yeah.
And
So when
that's
we
the-
do our land, sorry,
So when you do land calculations, you incorporate that in the thing.
we do to our best ability. We try to capture that into our work so that we can we can reflect the fact that, you know, you're not going to pay the same amount for land that is at a lower density than it is at a higher density. There's less of a variation with residential, as you'll see here, but on the commercial side, you can see that more.
Thank you.
I think that's it for.
Okay, so I have a bunch of questions. So first of all, I wanted to get a deeper understanding of the nexus, the calculations of, say, office and the side effects on retail versus that. So Commissioner Moore had that number of 4 or 5. Commissioner Fung had said that that's not really true because it's supposed to be spread out. But in the studies we have, and especially the Nexus study, what's the model use for those? Does it account for everything, or does it only account for the office and the rest is going to be separate?
So one disclaimer is that we did not do the Nexus study, but we're very familiar with the methodology. We've done other Nexus studies. For this Nexus study, the methodology was for each type of commercial building, they calculated the densities, how many workers would be employed directly by that building, run the modeling that's based on wages for those occupations. You have to make assumptions about household size because not every employee equals one housing unit. So you determine how many housing units are required and what's affordable to those households. So that is a direct relationship. So it's really the direct effect of that commercial building, but for each individual type of building. So an office development has its nexus calculation, a hotel development has its nexus calculation, and a retail development has its nexus
But they're not
calculation.
transitive. Like we don't follow through like what Commissioner Moore was saying.
Correct,
Okay.
that's right. So those indirect and induced effects are not part of the calculation. They are part of the calculation on the residential side. So because a resident is not a worker, so a resident could be a worker, but what you do is you look at that housing unit, how much spending is associated with that unit. You run that through an input-output model, a multiplier, to calculate how many workers are associated with the spending. So, you know, you go to the grocery store, the cashier that's associated with that new household that's generating new economic activity in your community. And then those workers, some of them will be lower wage workers. Many of them are service workers. So on the residential side, you often see that there is more of the low wage worker associated with those development projects. But there's fewer of them because it's more in direct relationship.
Okay.
And then in 2015, the reason that the housing nexus study was important in 2015 was because of the before the 2017 law change, the city couldn't require rental housing to provide on-site affordable housing. So it needed a nexus study to justify a fee it could charge to rent new rental housing development. Okay. The law has since changed, so the residential nexus study is doesn't have the same legal import that it did in 2015. The commercial nexus study, however, is still very relevant for setting the commercial linkage fees.
While we're on this point, just to clarify that a lot of about the Moretti thing and indirect employees, that is not, you know, speaking as a professional and an expert, indirect population effects are not part of a normal analysis. Is that correct?
So I'm not aware of any nexus study for a commercial linkage fee that looks at indirect and induced impacts, and I think a lot of it has to do with this double counting potential, because you are accounting for that somehow. Often you are accounting for that in other ways with other fees.
Okay. I think that's the part which I wanted to talk about. So any office development will require some housing development to be built based on RINA and other state laws, right? Do we have any like rough calculations of how that translates to the housing stock requirements and what that will work?
Well, the RINA isn't directly tied to job calculation. That's one of the factors that is to be considered during the new 6th cycle RENA allocation that's happening. But for the 5th cycle that we're in right now, the RENA is fixed. It doesn't change at all, regardless of how many office developments occur or don't occur. The job creation will be considered as one of the factors when assessing the 6th cycle RENA, and that's part of what ABAG, MTC, and the county and potentially the subregion, if that decides to be formed here, will be looking at to see how job numbers should be translated to local jurisdiction RENAs, but those decisions haven't been made yet.
Okay. Historically, they were tied to office creation, office space creation, and job creation.
In theory, that was part of the RENA allocation. That's part of the reason the law has changed, is that wasn't mandated. There wasn't a direct relationship, and some jurisdictions that had lots of employment generation still ended up with low RENAs for a variety of reasons. So that was one of the motivating factors to change the way that RENA methodology is calculated, and we're about to see how that plays out for the 6th cycle.
And that is linking it to job creation.
That will be that's one of the factors incorporated into the new RENA methodology. That's correct.
Thank you.
So just to clarify, and so that everybody understands, for the current RENA that we have today, there is no on a city-by-city basis direct link between your RENA allocation and the office, the employment in the city.
Yeah, so the RENA was assigned at the start of the 5th cycle. Job creation was, in theory, one of the factors that was considered at the time, but there was not a direct, because you have X number of jobs, your RENA must accommodate X number of housing units.
It would be fair to characterize that the way the RENA calculation is done is that regionally there is a projection of the amount of growth, and that is distributed using rules like your accessibility to transit. And those are how those numbers are determined.
Yes, so that in general, that's correct. There's a regional, so the ABAG MTC region will be assigned a figure by the state, and then there is methodology that's prescribed by statute, but still there's some local discretion to decide how to apply that methodology to determine what factors get considered in distributing that RENA between the different jurisdictions that make up the region.
And the newer law which you're saying passed, that does factor the job created as
It does make that one of the explicit factors that has to be incorporated in the methodology. It doesn't set a specific jobs housing ratio, but it does make the employment characteristics of a jurisdiction one of the factors that has to be considered by the methodology. And again, the region is just beginning to discuss what its methodology will look at, so we don't know exactly how that will be weighted for the 6th cycle yet.
Right, but for the last cycle, I think location to transit was a big deal in terms of density of build out relative to close to transit hubs, I think is the term used. And then I think the other factor was available developable land as well.
And sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think those two factors are what influenced the Cupertino allocation to not be necessarily as high as other areas.
One thing that used to be one of the factors was that the region would look at an individual jurisdiction's history at producing units. That has been removed from the statute. That's actually no longer allowed to be one of the factors. So a jurisdiction that doesn't have a history of producing units won't have a quote-unquote artificially reduced RENA going forward for the 6th cycle.
Is the general feeling, though, the next allocation is going to be a much bigger number than the current number?
Yeah,
Yes.
HCD staff has said that jurisdictions can expect between a 150 and 200% increase in their RENA going forward, and right. The precise allocations obviously will be different by different jurisdictions, but I think it's a safe assumption to assume that every jurisdiction is going to see their RENA increase, and some dramatically.
So I'm going to ask that Ben put up the RENA numbers since we're discussing them. And really the point I want to bring up about these is that our general plan says that we're going to be having 15% BMR units. And when I look at the RENA numbers, it seems as though we would need to have a lot higher percentage. I don't know if anyone would like to comment on that. But anyway, here are the RENA numbers that we currently have. And as you can see, we've got the 356 extremely low, very low projected need, and then 207 in the low projected need.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tension that's inherent in the structure of the law. I've had that exact conversation with HCD staff before, saying I've been in jurisdictions where HCD will object to a higher inclusionary percentage than 15%. I said, well, we're trying to meet the RENA needs. What is a jurisdiction supposed to do, especially with the loss of redevelopment, other funding sources to pay for that? It does leave jurisdictions in a difficult position to meet the needs of the low, very low, and extremely low income households.
So could I, there's a characterization here that just if you can confirm, the RENA number is a minimum requirement, not a maximum. So you're not intended to get 800 BMR units out of building only 1,000 residences. The intention is, I believe that HCD's stated intention has been, HCD's intention has been that you build many houses, and of those, you will produce 800, for Cupertino, there will be 800 BMR homes, and, many, many more than that in terms of market rate homes, which is also the objective of HCD.
I mean, I'd say in general that one of the animating factors at the state side tends to be it's a supply side economics view of housing and looking to create requirements to zone and accommodate as much housing as possible at all income levels, under the theory that as more market rate development housing becomes developed and available, that ultimately will fill some of that demand and make housing more accessible for everyone at different income levels.
It's certainly notable the way the 1,400 units that were allocated in the housing element, there was never any chance of achieving the RENA.
I mean, we've seen from the statewide determinations as HCD is evaluating and publishing every jurisdiction's APRs and their progress on their housing element. Almost no jurisdiction in California, I think 13 jurisdictions statewide have met all of their RENA for all of their income categories. And some of those were outliers like Beverly Hills, which had extremely low RENA allocations, which I won't even repeat because they're so absurd. But they're not targets that are achievable with the resources that jurisdictions have available in most cases, especially at the low and very low level.
Okay. So continuing on this point about the distribution of BMR, Commissioner Fungat brought up this point about how adding more moderate and median can make a project viable. Just for my education, what is the regulatory framework or how much flexibility does the regulatory framework allow us to make those adjustments?
So under the same theory that the city can require housing be produced for low-income households, you can require it for median and moderate income. The city does do that in ownership projects. You have regulatory authority to do that. Again, you're limited by making sure that the development remains feasible. The other thing to balance is if the city does want to produce units that it can take credit for on its APR, there's an incentive to match the requirements for production with the income levels that you're being evaluated against. So for example, SB 35 eligibility or potentially in the future state funding and grants will be tied to the ability to produce very low and low income housing. And that would create an incentive for the city to require more of that as opposed to above moderate income housing or moderate income housing where you don't get the same RENA credit. But that's not a legal requirement, it's a policy choice. You're allowed to require units for those income levels.
Because SB 35, we got caught up in that because we didn't meet the very low and low income requirements.
So,
So I would actually comment with regard to to adding a this report didn't lead toward retooling the inclusionary requirements to include moderate or on the other side extremely low. I strongly encourage that, although I guess I'm supposed to wait until we're deliberating to say that. One of the things that does become a factor, though, is that median and moderate housing would not qualify for the density bonus program, and that actually has the cost effect of those units costing much more because you're not gaining density or units. So it's quite challenging to include the. I mean, the deck is kind of stacked to make it very difficult to build those units.
okay, so the density bonus is mandated by the state, and if you go towards medium and moderate, the developer can't ask for it, but the city can still grant it.
No, I think the way to characterize it is the density bonus, please correct me, staff can correct me if I'm wrong, the density bonus, you qualify for it by building very low and low units as well as senior units. And you can do that at different levels. But the problem is if you build, you don't get any extra credit for an extra low income unit, and you don't get any credit for a moderate unit. So the city could, in theory, grant a bonus multiplier if you built a particular mix. This again was the main thrust of the VACO specific plan Tier 2. To qualify for Tier 2, you had to waive your right to use the density bonus law, but you were mandated a mix, which was including moderate and I believe include extra low as well.
Okay, so from the point of view of the city staff or the first responders or the teachers, that would have been helpful.
Yes.
Actually, from Chapter 1956 from our municipal code for density bonus, for very low income units, if you wanted to, under density bonus law, if you're looking at maximizing your concessions, 15% or greater, very low income. For low income, 30% or greater, and you'd get your 3 concessions. And then for moderate income units, 30% or greater, there are 3 concessions there. The city also, in the municipal code, has a city density bonus that you qualify for if you have 100% affordable. And it's not, to my recollection, it's not specified how great a density bonus that you would receive for that. So they did something different with the Tier 2 that was specific to that development agreement, and it wasn't following the Cupertino municipal code. So I would be curious to see what a project would look like if they followed the municipal code.
Yeah.
Municipal code, and did the 100% affordable route.
Yeah. I mean, it's a specific plan, so it would override the municipal code anyway. But I think that I think there was a belief that was a viable product mix, and I think that's echoed in the SV at Home recommendations that have come out around in the past as well.
Okay. I'm going to slightly shift topics a bit. I wanted to understand, and this is from education, that when you do modeling, and you mentioned that it is sensitive to many of the input factors. Like a long time ago, I used to price mortgages, and we used to have models where you would consider different scenarios. So or is there a standard practice in the industry to actually have a quadrant of worst case, best case, median case, expected case kind of a thing?
We do sometimes do the sensitivity testing, particularly when we think that there might be the result might be infeasible, but a lot of times jurisdictions want to know what can we be doing to enhance the feasibility. So some of the strategies that you've been discussing changing the income mixes, and there are a lot of different ways of thinking about it. So this is kind of a simplified way of just representing, you know, changes in rents, changes in construction costs. Our model is very sensitive to those specific assumptions, specifically construction costs, land costs, and rental rates. So that was kind of the thinking around that. And, you know, I think that the results here will show that for the highest density rental prototype, it's really very close to penciling out. So it's really just a matter of maybe some slight changes in rents. If you were able to build a product type that was a little bit different, that maybe we're able to command a little bit higher rents. So that type of thinking is kind of what's underlying that. But it wasn't a very detailed type of analysis that looked at every input.
Thank you.
Okay, I did find the section in the municipal code, and I have a question about this. So for density bonus calculations, it says the city at its discretion may grant a density bonus higher than the maximum set forth in table 1956-030 to a housing development where all units except the manager's units are affordable to lower income households. And my question is, would that development be subject to mitigation fees the way it's written right now? And if they're making it 100% affordable, would we actually want to waive the mitigation fees for it?
So is your question asking, would an affordable project be required to pay housing mitigation fees, affordable housing mitigation fees?
If the one as described in the municipal code, if all the units are affordable to lower income households, and then they're qualifying for this the city's discretionary density bonus, so they'd still have to pay the mitigation fee.
There's a way of calculating the mitigation fees. It's in our housing mitigation procedure manual. So it looks at the level of affordability of the unit. So if it's 100% affordable, then I believe the fees are waived. But if there's a mixture of affordable with market rate, then there's a credit given to those affordable units. So the example we have in the manual is if there's a project with 42 units with a 15% inclusionary requirement would have 6.3 units. And so you do a calculation and then you get that number from there. The development would pay 0.3 of the fee. And it's in the manual, but the fee equates to $120,000 at that point. This is 2015. But in general, the fee wouldn't apply to those affordable units.
Okay, so it would, though, if they took the density bonus, whatever the city would give them for those, because those would be market rate, I would assume?
Market rates still get charged, but you do the calculation and you see what would be charged to it based off our manual. So you'd have to look at the project as a whole in order to kind of pencil out the calculations to determine what, if any, fees are required.
And then there was another part in the presentation that I wanted to mention, and that's the way the BMR program is written up. In the general plan, it says that you would have for rental the 15%, and then when you look at 15% would be affordable, and then when you look at the BMR manual, it only says when a development proposes to provide on-set rental BMR units, the affordability requirements for units shall be as follows: 60% of BMR units as very low income and 40% as low income. And if a single BMR unit is provided, it shall be designated for very low income. And I think that if it's supposed to be saying 15%, because it was actually multiplied out in the report, if it's supposed to be saying 15%, I would prefer that this was actually included. This is more of a request to staff, I guess, that it was actually included in the BMR manual, because the way it's sitting now, you've got two separate requirements. So that when I read this BMR manual, it says to me that no matter how many affordable units are being provided for, 60% of those need to be very low income. So if you were to have, 40% affordable that you decided to do, of that 40%, it would be a 60-40 split. That's how I read it. So, and then I'm seeing it interpreted as being the 60% multiplied by the 15 in the report.
I have a question about the peer cities. So there is, for San Jose, for the ownership base, the in lieu fees are 153,000 per unit. So like, okay.
Which, I don't know, staff can talk about, if you were paying for a full unit's worth of in lieu fees, what the city, Cupertino's fees might actually even be higher than that, right?
Higher than the cost of the unit?
Well, then the 153,000 in lieu fee.
Yeah, well, it'd be based off the square footage of the unit. So it's a function of that. So if the unit was 3,000 square feet, you do the multiplier. I think right now our fees are around 25,000. So whatever that math is, it'd be 750,000, something like that, in fee. That would be required.
Okay, thank you.
Or 75, sorry, 7,000, not 700.
Just for some additional context on San Jose too, it's partly also because they're really trying to encourage on-site units.
I have a quick question from the Nexus Study from May 5th, 2015. And it says under their next steps, PDF page 8, they say that the fees will be adjusted annually for CPI. Has that been occurring?
Yes, that has been occurring. So the fees, again, go up every year based on CPI. They just went up this past July 1st.
Okay, great. And then the last part was the city has the ability to issue an annual RFP to solicit projects for acquisition, rehabilitation, and or development of affordable housing units. Has that also been happening?
Would you mind repeating that for me? I was looking up some material.
Oh, sure, no problem.
Thank you.
The city has the ability to issue an annual RFP to solicit projects for acquisition, rehabilitation, and or development of affordable housing units. And if it is occurring, could you mention a little bit about it?
Sure. So annually, around November through February, the city issues our Notice of Funding Availability / Request for Proposal. So we call it the NOFA RFP. And that's for all of the Housing and Human Services grant funds. And that comes through Housing Commission and City Council for the fiscal year of July 1st. And so I'll give you some examples. We have our below market rate affordable housing fund that has the capital housing projects. We also have a below market rate affordable housing fund for public services, which is like fair housing, tenant, landlord. Then we have our general fund human services grant, which is $100,000. And then we have our CDBG pot, which is capital housing and public services. So it's all released at the same time, and we take in applications and award out funds usually for a 2-year cycle for public service and then a 1-year cycle for capital housing. And our CDBG funds are set by HUD, by the federal government, and that comes in around $250,000. And then our current below market rate affordable housing fund balance is about $6 million. And so all of our funds are awarded on a competitive basis. And the application process is usually, we release in November, and we usually have a deadline of February. Housing Commission reviews in March or April, and we award for a July 1st start for shovel-ready projects for capital housing, and then for public services projects that are ready to launch into the community at that time.
Great, thank you.
Should we open it for public comments now? Okay. We are now opening the floor for public comments. I have a few blue slips with me. So the first speaker is Jennifer Griffin.
Good evening, Planning Commission. I did attend the housing meeting, And I think this was a really, really good report. I actually sort of understood it, which was surprising. But I think they did a very good job. It was the first time I'd ever really seen a feasibility study done, and it was in depth. So I can understand how they're getting their calculations from it. And it does give the city some ability to find out where their ranges of fees could be increased. Based on listening to the study at the Housing Commission and then reading the literature again tonight, I would just make a few comments. I understand there was a potential, possibly, reduction in the parking, but I don't think that works for Cupertino. I don't want to live in a city that's underparked. We're a small city. We're at 58,000 right now. We're not a really large area. We're mainly residential. And I try to shop in the city as much as I can, which means I have to drive from Stevens Creek, from the very eastern end of Cupertino, to get downtown. I guess wherever downtown to me is Dianza Boulevard and Stevens Creek and beyond. And I don't want to have shopping be a hassle in Cupertino. There's already a lot of problems in Cupertino. We've drastically lost our retail, and I don't want to have the lack of potential of parking to be an impediment to me shopping in my city, so that if I decide to go downtown into Cupertino, that there's no place to park. Well, when I'm a really old lady, I can take the transit again. I took it to San Jose State, but I can take the bus back and forth on Stevens Creek Boulevard, but I'm not there yet. So I really don't want Cupertino to be underparked. We're having the problem at Stern. There's a hotel in my neighborhood where San Jose wants to not have adequate parking for their hotel. My neighborhood will be flooded with all the overflow parking, and we're not going to do that. I think the residents have decided that Cupertino is a place we plan on living in, and we want to be able to have adequate parking. I'm just going to make a comment about the R&D. Is there any way that we could actually charge more fees if companies had corporate offices or regional headquarters or sales office? I remember we discussed that here years ago when the city was talking about doing internet fees. This was a long time ago, if there was a regional office here. So maybe you can discuss that. I thought that was the first time we'd seen R&D in there, but maybe we need to talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Connie Cunningham.
Good evening, Chair and Commissioners. I'm Connie Cunningham. I am in the Housing Commission, but I'm here just speaking self-only tonight. I basically wanted to bring up, I had received a comment from a resident, so it made me wonder about something. What it was talking about was the fees, the non-residential fees, and the fact that medical offices were different from tech offices and that. So since in the report itself it talks about office/R&D, it talks about hotel, and it talks about retail, but it doesn't talk about any other subset of types of offices. So it was suggested to me by the staff that I look at the 2015 Nexus, and in the 2015 Nexus it talks specifically about the tech, the R&D, industrial, and medical. And it talks about all of them, and in a couple of different places, one having to do with employees and one having to do with something else. It talked about them being all put together, and for a reason. There was a rationale for both of them, one by employee and one by the other. So that, I thought, helped me, because I had certainly thought that's what it was, that it was all incorporated, and based on my input at the time of the Housing Commission meeting. So I just didn't know if you had heard that comment or not, but I just wanted to, I guess, ask if that's I mean, that was my understanding from the Nexus study, so I just wanted to present it to the Planning Commission. And that's all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The next speaker is Lisa Warren.
So this is going to be all over the place. First, there are lots of assumptions. You use the word assumptions a lot, which is alarming. But I think an assumption that we have a big problem with is linked to zoning when property is purchased. And the assumption that it can be rezoned for something that it's not zoned for. That creates problems. I feel like this is a battle of the feasibles, sort of. You know, feasibility, let me back up. There's no secret that many proposed mixed-use projects cause jobs to housing ratios to head in the wrong direction. So is it feasible to allow a developer to have a feasible way to make money and still damage the community in a way that can't be fixed? That's not feasible for the community. So this whole thing makes me absolutely crazy. And it's happening everywhere. We're in the thick of it. And actually, someone spoke at a meeting recently and gave a description of a bully. Well, I can tell you that my impression of many developers, especially a particular one in this community, is that they are a humongous, unacceptable bully. Okay, so I'm going to go to Commissioner Moore's math. I just want to point out that I was at the ribbon cutting yesterday. It was very nice. And by the way, I did meet one of the residents who said, I have 2 words, very grateful. So just take that back to your crew, everybody. So it was really nice to meet the new neighbors and see the facility. But the number quoted, as Commissioner Moore mentioned, was $800,000 per unit. It was, and these are 350, I think, square foot studio units. They're single capacity. That's 19 people. That's not 19 couples or 19 families. And I think that's missed. Thankfully, along the line, you did mention, you used the term household sizes, which I think is missing from a lot of this conversation. I've said it 100 times for 100 different reasons. You can't just say a residential unit. You need to describe the square footage of that unit. And, in my opinion, the ceiling size, because that affects things. I'm going to not probably say what I really wanted to say the most. If I can figure out what it was. Anyway, to the theoretical maximums, $129, and I'm seeing a feasibility of $30.
Yeah.
I ask you to evaluate what feasible is, and I encourage you to go as high as you can toward that 129 number for office.
Thank you. We done public comments on this topic? No more blue sheets? Okay, thank you. So now the floor is open for more deliberations. Okay, we seem to have one more public comment on this topic.
My name is Gwynnie Van Buren, and I have lived in Cupertino for around 45 to 50 years. But anyway, I think it's about time we come to accept that we need more dense, reasonable housing costs. For young people, like better teachers for our high schools, I mean, we really need more affordable housing, or else we're just going to, our school is going to go down the hill and all our property is going to go down in value. So that's my comment. I think that, it's good to say, yeah, we'd like to have single-family housing, low cost, but that's just not realistic. So let's face it. We need higher density housing, maybe better public transportation, and I think that's the goal that we should try to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more public comments? Cool. So we can probably move on to the deliberations on the panel. Commissioners, do you have anything else to add to the discussion we've had?
Sure. So let's see. So first of all, I think I found this to be really fascinating. Fascinating kind of capture of the state of the world right now. In particular, in the context of some of our region, about a year and a half ago in San Jose, they did a pretty sad analysis where they kind of looked at all the different kinds of new properties they'd entitled and found that none of them were feasible because of insufficient rents, and that's that instability. So, I would hope, because we're sending comments up to the council on this, I hope that they'll keep feasibility as an important consideration, and that really means, I think you need to take a very close look at some of the things which appear to be infeasible now. This is exactly that case of volatility here, where the land prices have caused. It looks to me like the decisions that were made in the prior BMR program were pretty much, they looked like they were pretty much right on, and now they have slipped slightly into the infeasible range or into the marginal range. So I would encourage, for a couple of these, we're clearly seeing that with rental housing, which is, been the kind of preferred direction of production. So I would encourage the council to consider that, and that may mean backing off the, consider backing off the inclusionary rate. I would really encourage, if the staff has the opportunity to do so, to do a kind of a find the zero analysis here, where you find out here's the point. If that point is now moved from 15 to 13 and a half, that is valuable to know, and something that I think would help guide the council in making right decisions. I'm a little torn. I think that I was in the meeting where the council asked for this study, and in some respects, I kind of feel like there was a bit of somebody ought to pay that was asked to be studied, and so I think this has been a good study to show that there's an area where people can afford to pay more, and that is probably not the area that they were aiming at, which would be single-family homes, townhouses, and condominiums. One of the things that I think, again, would be a useful piece of information to help the council, guide their thinking. I'm fine either way with considering an increase in the inclusionary rate on these cases of the owner housing, but just as a kind of point here, did the calculation of how many dollars does that translate into, and for a detached single-family home of the very large size that we're talking about, is 3,800 square feet in this prototype. The incremental cost from going to the next higher rate, to the 20% rate, was $111,000 in that on that house, which I believe would probably must have been $200,000 already. So I mean that's a lot of money. On a condo, the increase would become $51,625 from the proposed rate. So those are numbers that are big enough. On one hand, the feasibility study demonstrates that it's tolerable. On the other hand, I think just need to kind of make a decision about whether that's what you want to do or not. We all are concerned that apartments cost too much. The high-density housing, which was the only one that could tolerate the in lieu fee, that in lieu fee change was something like on the order of $28,140 so per unit, and that's an increase above what was currently charged today. So those are some pretty big numbers. I think one of the things that's really important to remember is that we really do want to look at feasibility and understand how we can do the most for the, for the parts of the community that need it the most. But the danger is that when you drive a project into the infeasible range, you don't get the housing, you don't get the housing or retail, you don't get the on-site units that would have been built, and you don't get affordable fees either if it just sits. So you want to strike a balance there between those different sources. And I think there's also the issue about being competitive. The discussion around office, the office linkage fee. Again, the financial feasibility shows that can be done if we were to go to a higher number than our neighbors, And this is just sort of, it's kind of a herd thing because a lot of people caught up with Cupertino. I think Mountain View went first to that level, and then Cupertino, and then a number of other cities. Santa Clara had no affordable program until they went to one that was very similar to what was done here, and that was only a year and a half or 2 years ago. So on one hand, again, you want to balance. You want to make sure that there's a fee there that's meaningful. At the same time, I do think there's value in kind of keeping an eye on the people around you, because that's where the project will end up if you decide to go to what becomes a prohibitive fee. I would definitely encourage. Again, this is tough because you guys, the staff had marching orders to generate a report. I would definitely, from this planning commissioner, I would strongly encourage looking at a few more prototypes. Those ones that I brought up before, I think they're the main ones, were to look at prototypes that had rental with no retail, right? So that you can understand the impact of retail use, because it appears to be, it appears to be a negative impact. So that can help make low density housing, more affordable. The other one you would want to look at, looking at mixes that include ELI and moderate. And I think that in the spirit of what the council was looking for, the current BMR program kind of mirrors somewhat the density bonus law categories. I think that there's a very genuine interest in trying to have median, moderate, and ELI as part of that mix, and have that be part of the mandated mix. In particular, because density bonus doesn't apply for median and moderate units, that makes the financial calculation probably pretty hairy, pretty ugly. But I think that that's something that's very, very valuable, because at the end of the day, one of the things that was happening whether it was the Hamptons discussion, the Hamptons discussion, originally it was going to be a big, $26 million affordable fee because they couldn't require the housing. Commissioner Takahashi was here at the Planning Commission when they said, hey, can you turn that into $25 million of units instead, right? And that mix was modified when it came to the council, because it very specifically, Councilman Sinks was looking very specifically, hey, can I get some moderate units here? Can we do something? There's a demand in the city to try to support teacher housing. And we're not going to do that on a grand scale, but on a small scale, on a small scale for those, I think he ended up, the negotiation, because it went back and forth for quite a long time, that probably was 17 or 18 moderate units, I think. I can look it up, but, that 17 or 18 teachers, but there can be 17 or 18 teachers down the line that will be a big difference in their ability to be here. So I think that's good. I think the only other comment I have to say is that, again, I feel it's a really solid study, and there were improvements, you know, in the changes between the two drafts. There was some additional kind of educational information illuminating why it was that the study is done in the way it is. And I think that that's actually very useful to have in the community. We have a problem here. We have even a little bit tonight. There are definitely some numbers out there. There are things that, you know, they're not a part of a normal, you know, part of a normal analysis. And if we can, you know, figure out how to kind of stay on point with things that are meaningful, I think that that's, you know, that would be a benefit to the community. So again, thank you. I think that there was, you know, the problem is it sounds like I would want you to do a whole nother additional study, but there's so much great information here that boy, I'd love it if you did another study on top of that.
Thank you, Commissioner Fan. Who wants to go next? Commissioner Moore? Or Commissioner Takahashi?
I'm still cogitating, so give me a couple more minutes.
Commissioner Moore?
So I'd like to mention some of the Housing Commission comments, their feedback. So their recommended production requirements were 20% for single-family units, between 20 and 25% for townhomes and condominiums, and 15% no change for rental housing. They requested that you prohibit in lieu fees for any residential development project with 7 or more units to promote BMR unit production. And their recommended commercial linkage fees were $25 to $30 per square foot for office, $15 per square foot for hotel, and $11.88 per square foot, which is no change for retail. And I didn't actually see something saying favorable towards how we could make it pencil out for the extremely low income and the developmentally disabled housing, and that's troubling. I would have liked to have seen that. For office and R&D uses, I'm bothered by the fact that we seem to be limited at $30. And for the 300,000 square foot office development, even if we increase it to 30 from the 2376, we're getting 1.9 million, and that's equivalent to roughly 2 units in the veranda. That doesn't seem like we're getting very far. And you know, part of the reason that we have such a shortage in housing is because of all of the office development that we've had. We've had something like 112 months of positive job growth in the state. It just seems like we could send a stronger message, I would like to see, about the problems that the office build has had in the area, and you know, something along the lines where we're sending a message that we're heading towards having a moratorium here in order to put a stop to it. But it looks like we are limited due to the word feasibility at $30 for the office fee. And you know, I've tried to negotiate, you know, to I believe it was $122, but I'm not seeing that there's a way to do that. No, it's 129. I just don't see how we can get to that number legally. And so I guess I'd like to, you know, have that the final answer be, it's like, yes, $30 is your limit, if that indeed is the case. And for, you know, for the $15 for hotel, is that within our range, and we're okay doing that legally? So those are just 2 questions about what we can do, and if we want to send that message that we really want to put our foot down on this office build out, you know, is this not the route to do it? Is this something that more of a city council decision to say we're going to do an office moratorium if that's where they're headed?
Commissioner Takahashi?
Yeah, so this kind of gets to the heart of a lot of regional issues for us, obviously, and the Greater Valley. And you can tell by the results of the studies that it's a paradox that, at least on first order, looks pretty impossible to solve. I mean, just the fact that if you look at the RENA BMR targets versus the total, they're not compatible with each other. So if the intent here is to make a recommendation that strives for a balance, if you will, of office and housing and affordable housing, then the path there would be to increase the fees on the office. Definitely sensitive to the reasonable element of interpretation and feasible. I'm assuming that our study is the first line of defense against litigation with regard to or challenging, I guess, that fee. And so I echo Commissioner Moore's assessment and or agreement with what the Housing Commission recommended. You know, they obviously, that's their main element, is to really understand the housing issues for the city. You know, with regard to the impacts to residential, those fees, if you looked at I would assume that increasing that to a higher percentage does definitely stand out in comparison to all the other municipalities in the region, which is kind of a red flag, it seems like, from the standpoint of potential challenge. I guess that would be something to consider, is how strong is our report to defend us as an outlier, or are we leading edge, right? Are we acknowledging the challenge at hand and how it is going to be a cost that has to be borne. That's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Takahashi. To conclude, first of all, I would like to thank you again for a report which was easy to understand. I really love the fact that you have metrics which are easy to relate to. Makes it, that's what's very commonly used by investors, so good to have that there. I also feel that feasibility is important, and we should think of adjusting the mix, especially to make sure that the extremely low income get addressed and the needs of city workers and first responders and other people who work in the community gets addressed. So if we have the latitude to do it within it, we should address it. That's the second aspect I would talk about. I think for offices, well, we had a brief debate about the RENA allocations and so on, but the fact remains that while we don't really know what it exactly is going to be, it is going to be different from what it used to be in the past, and it will be more likely to be correlated to what the jobs are being added in the city compared to the past. So we need to also keep that in mind while we calculate the impact. I think that's all I had to say. If there's nothing else left, we can probably close on this topic now. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we are going to now move on to the fourth topic. I know a lot of people have been waiting patiently for that. The subject here is the hillside exception to allow for the construction of a new 4,076 square foot, 2-story single-family residence within the 15% sight line of a prominent ridge line. Application number EXC 20807. Applicants Walter Chapman, Barney residence. Location 21650 Rodenberg Court, APN 366-38007. The recommended action here is to conduct the public hearing and find that the proposed actions are exempt from CEQA and approve the application per the draft resolution. So, does the staff have a report on this? Okay, thank you.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners, and I'm John Martino, Associate Planner with the City of Cupertino's Community Development Department, and I'm the project planner for this application, as I have been since day one, about a year and a half ago when the applicant came in to just over the counter ask questions about what can I do with my property. Well, let's get started. So here we go. Here we are about a year and a half later, and I'm just pleased to present this project in front of you. So again, as Vice Chair Saxena had mentioned, this is a hillside exception permit for the construction of a new 4,076 square foot single family residence within the 15% sight line of a prominent ridgeline. The applicant is the architect, Walter Chapman, representing Zuri Barneve, who's one of the homeowners of the site. And the location is 21650 Rainbow Court. So a little quick background of the site. It is a hillside zone property, 21, which means that the minimum net lot area, if subdivided, would need to be 21,000 square feet. The residence on this, there had been a residence on the site. This would be the third attempt for a home. The first residence was only lasted about 8 years. It was built, it was occupied, and then it was demolished in '88. It was tried again to develop, and if you've been to the site or seen pictures of the site, Google Earth, whatever else, you've seen that there's a lot of remaining concrete slab, foundation, retaining wall that remained from the approved building permit in the 1990s, but for various reasons, the property owner never went through with the development. That being said, so now we have new property owners, and they would like to see this site developed. So a little bit of context for the neighborhood. It is surrounded by similarly zoned properties, hillside properties. All the neighbors are single-family parcels, and this is I would say, the last parcel to be developed in the immediate vicinity. So it does have two frontages, one along Rainbow Court and one along Upland Way. The Rainbow Court portion is considered the front, while the Upland Way portion is considered the rear. So prominent ridgeline, what is a prominent ridgeline? So a prominent ridgeline factors into within only our RHS ordinance, and essentially what it is defined as a line formed by the meeting of tops of sloping surfaces of land that are highly visible. So throughout the city we have many prominent ridgelines, and actually you can see even within this neighborhood we have the prominent ridgeline located right here, and another one about a block away located right there. Per our RHS ordinance, any new structures or additions to existing structures shall not disrupt the 15% sightline from a prominent ridgeline. And I'll go in the next slide what the sightline is. Does that mean that you can never build within a prominent ridgeline or within that sightline? No, it does not mean that. However, if there is some type of impracticality or situations on the property, you can get an exception, such as these property owners, to build within that sightline. So this is what a sightline is. So this is for the current application. So what we have over here, we have the top of the ridgeline that's closest to the home. So it's based on a 15% sightline. So you essentially just draw out a line like this, measure down 15%, and there you have it right here. So what the ordinance says is that you should not develop within this sight line without an exception. So essentially the reason why is to essentially keep high visibility of structures from the valley floor away from the ridgeline and keep those ridgelines open. However, there are certain circumstances where you are allowed to do that, to build within it. So the intent of the hillside ordinance is to minimize the discourage visual disturbances of the foothills, as mentioned prior. We can consider an exception for approval under unique circumstances or hardships. And these, any design of a home should be to minimize the exception and any impacts on the hillside. For example, on this site, there are certain site constraints that limit development on the property without a hillside exception, without having to apply for a hillside exception, rather. So here's here's a modified topographic map of the parcel itself, and this has been placed on this slide to show you what kind of constraints we have over here. So here's the proposed home in this area, the location. What staff had requested of the architect was to show on the topographic map in the shaded areas the portions of the parcel that are 30% sloped or greater, which is kind of our threshold for when you need an exception, or kind of the most kind of the start of when the steepest of the slopes.
Could you repeat that? The shaded parts represent a 30% or greater slope.
Yes, yes, yes. So let me just circle those for the viewers at home and in the audience. So we go like this. Okay. Further, you have setbacks for the home that are approximately in this area, right? Further, you have access easements, which you're not allowed to develop in. So what is the homeowner left with? A little flat area at the top of the parcel. And so again, a couple of things. We want, as part of the ordinance, we want to minimize any type of disturbance of the hillside. So it's a flat area, which means what? Minimizing any excavation of the site, minimizing any grading and whatnot. If they were developed in this area, you would look at something as substantial grading of the side of the hill. What staff had looked at with the applicant was this area has already been graded, and naturally it's flatter. I would say something probably less than 10% slope in that and whatnot, which is, for the RHS ordinance, considered pretty much flat land. I had been on the site a few times. This is a site view from Upland Way. You can see the arrow kind of showing which direction it's taken from. So this is kind of a visual demonstration of how steep that slope is of the 30% area. So staff supports hillside exceptions for this site because the siding design of the proposed house minimizes the grading and removal of existing landscaping in a manner consistent of the RHS ordinance. And in fact, if you've gone through the application, you can see that no trees are proposed to be removed as part of this application. So the second part is that we look at, so we got the site, the exact site of the home established or supported by staff. Now we have to look at the RHS design standards. So the RHS has certain standards that differ from, let's say, in a regular R1 residential lot, a zone lot in like Rancho or anywhere else in the city. So specifically, the building shall follow the primary natural contour of the lot. For example, we don't want to see homes that are placed on sticks on the side of the hill. It should flow with the side of the hill. There should be offsets in the building form. So what we don't want to see, what the ordinance doesn't want to see, is a big 25-foot wall with no offsets or variations with it. So you have a nice looking design that someone from the Valley Fork can look up and see these variations, almost like a movie screen to look at. And again, these two kind of are the same architectural feature elements to provide relief and breakup of expansive wall planes. And probably the fourth major design standard is that any building, any residence should have natural earth tone or vegetative colors not exceeding 60 LRVs. LRV is light reflective value, basically 60 and below. This is a 3D image of the home. I didn't want to steal the applicant's thunder by showing all the 3D images. He was very excited to present this, and he has his own presentation. So, unfortunately, I didn't receive this in time to put it as part of the application. But you can see how this is very well done, and that the facade of the home has a lot of variation, a lot of offsets, and that's very much consistent with the RHS ordinance. Certain architectural features that give it those offsets are the bay window right here, the balconies, and the arcades on the first floor. So the applicant does a really nice job in varying that offset for the wall. This is a view that's coming from the Rainbow Court side. And what you see, what the neighbor would see looking from Rainbow Court is really a one-story structure. And you can see how well the architect had done in allowing the building to follow the contours of the hillside. So our recommendation is to find that the proposed actions are exempt from CEQA and to approve the hillside exception. Both the applicant and the property owner are here, and the property owner does have a presentation whenever Planning Commission is ready to hear that.
Does the city staff have any more presentations?
There's no more city staff presentation. I think next one will be the applicant, if you allow the applicant to present as well.
Okay, thank you.
So the applicant, or the property owner, if you wish to present, that's the opportunity. Thank you.
So my name is Walter Chapman. I'm the designer for the residence, and even though I'm officially the applicant, the property owner would actually like to do a presentation addressing many of his concerns and concerns of the neighborhood. So I'm available to answer any technical questions pertaining to the design.
Hi, good evening. My name is Zuri Barneev. I'm the owner at 21650 Rainbow Court. John, was there the presentation on here, or?
I just put up right now. So just let me know when you want to switch slides.
So yeah, you can switch it. So John kind of stole my thunder because a lot of what I was going to say, he's already said. So I'll go through it very quickly and just focus more on the problems on the site. But this is just another view from sort of like a drone perspective of the area, and you can see Upland Way and Rainbow Court on the right, where Rainbow Court ends. I think the important thing to note on this picture is that there's only one house that actually looks down on our property, and that's the Van Buren residence, and they happen to be here tonight to talk about their feelings about the project. The proposed home is where it's pointed to in the picture, and it's basically replacing what was already there before. And so you can switch to the next one. This slide just shows it again from another perspective, where the proposed driveway would come down from Rainbow Court and connect to the house. I think one of the things you'll notice when you see this picture, in case you haven't been on the site, is just the amount of garbage and vandalism and graffiti that is there. The previous owner tore the house down with the intent of rebuilding it, but unfortunately passed away before he was successful at doing it. And so the foundation has basically been sitting dormant for over 20 years. I don't know if you can. So that's where the problems come in, and I don't know how aware the commissioners are of the problems on this site. It's been what some here have described as sort of a constant nuisance, basically, in the city for over 20 years. It's become sort of, it has a cult following among the high school students and people from out of the area as well, where they basically come and hang out in the foundation area there and treat it like a second home. And so lots of bad things have happened there. I mean, some things are a little more benign, like graffiti and things like that. You can switch to the next one. But that's kind of what it looks like. It's pretty horrible. There's a lot of that going on there. There's obviously a lot of trash and vandalism and graffiti. You can switch next one again. As a picture of a giant fireworks that was there. Obviously, there's a lot of dry brush around, and I guess there's some police activity that in the reports that they were setting off or starting bonfires there. And we all know that with a high fire severity zone like this, kids starting fires or setting off fireworks is a pretty big deal for the community. You can switch next one. You know, noise, there's drugs found there. The police arrested some people with guns. It's a serious problem, and some of the neighbors I've spoken to have said that they've tried stopping the people that come onto the property, and some of them were pretty aggressive towards those neighbors. So it's a very unpleasant situation, and I think everyone pretty much agrees, including the city staff, but mostly the neighbors and myself, that probably the only long-term solution to this fairly long-term problem is to develop it and to put a house where there was a house before and basically finish that development once and for all and occupy it. And once we occupy it, I think all of these problems are going to disappear forever. So that's what I mentioned here, and I won't get into this too much, but obviously we need a hillside exception in order to build there. And this is something John already showed, but I'm just showing it from a different perspective. The yellow line is what he identified as the natural ridge line. The red is our property line. The blue is what I added just to show where the flat area drops off into a more steep slope. And so where the foundation is now is exactly where we would propose to build the new structure. And it's as far away as we can be from that ridge line without encroaching onto that sloped area and potentially disturbing that sloped area, which would not be favorable at all. Go to the next one. So just in summary, we're proposing to build a home where a home was already built and approved by the city of Cupertino. We're building as far away from the ridgeline as practically can be done. And we're building, although it's a large home, for the size of the lot, which is close to an acre, it's pretty modest in size. So we're not building, Taj Mahal here. This is just one last slide just to kind of give you a perspective on the impact this home has to the neighbors. The picture on the left shows you what you would see when you come to the driveway, which is basically nothing. The Van Buren's residence is just to the right of that, and again, they're the only neighbors that can actually see the entire home and the lot. Everyone else sees it, either very small chunks of it or not at all. The picture on the right is similar to what John was showing before, that from upland, it's basically not noticeable. And so the impact is very minimal. You really have to be on the property to see the whole thing. Yeah, and you've already seen these pictures, so I won't bore you with them again. And unless you have any questions, I can turn it over to Walter, or if you have any questions. I know we have some neighbors that wrote letters of support, and we have one neighbor who was here up until 10 o'clock, but she had to leave, so she actually wrote a statement that I can read if you feel like it's appropriate. And I know we have at least the Van Buren family here who are the most impacted by this development that would like to speak as well.
I'd like to indicate that I did a site visit today, and I scouted around the area, and I did speak with the neighbors. I spoke to Don Van Buren about the project.
Vice Chair, I think now you can, if you have any questions, now's the time for commission. If you have any questions for staff or for the property owner, before you open up for public comment.
I have a question. I still haven't understood where the problem comes from in this house. Like, where exactly do we need the exemption from? And what's the view which is going to be blocked? So if you can just show me a little bit more.
Absolutely. So, and we'll pull up the slide that shows a 15% line of the prominent ridge line. Again, so when you have a prominent ridge, as indicated right there, you have to maintain, according to ordinance, a 15% view angle free of any structures, right? And that's, again, the intent of that is to protect folks in the valley, their view of prominent ridges and whatever else too.
And the ridge line there was the yellow thing marked in the...
Correct.
So that was already a road. There was already some kind of a road there?
Yes, and in fact, if you look at if I go up to a few more, if you look at this slide right here, you can see there's already homes in the neighborhood built basically on top of the ridge line.
Yeah, and John, I appreciate you bringing up that point, but the goal is not to allow introduction of houses sticking up above the ridge line. And this house is actually at a much lower profile than current houses that were built prior to that rule. So it'll be less visible than what is already been seen from the valley, from the city floor.
Commissioner Moore, you would want to say something?
Okay, yeah, so I took some photographs while I was out at the project, and I actually found the definition of prominent ridgeline kind of a little confusing in this area, because the house is actually quite a bit lower than some of the others. And so here's one of the photographs. That will work. Okay, and that I'm holding my camera pretty level. So this house is quite a bit higher, and I think. And I think this, you can tell that the surrounding homes are also quite a bit higher. And so I did stop into the Van Buren's, because that was the one home that I felt that they would have a view of the property, and I believe they're going to speak during public comment in a few minutes.
Thank you. I think this helps me understand the ridgeline issue better. So unless we have more questions.
So I'm curious, when was the 15% sightline law regulation?
That's a really good question. I don't know the exact history of that. I would assume sometime within the last 30 years.
Okay. So it's possible it applied when the previous home was there?
From what I can...
Don't know.
From my research, it wasn't applied at that time.
Okay.
So I'm assuming sometime in the mid-90s.
Thank you.
But that's my guess.
Commissioner Takahashi?
No, all my questions were answered.
Okay, so I think we should probably open it for public comments now. So I'm start with Greenie Van Buren.
I'm sorry? Hi, I'm going to be the next door neighbor of this new house that's going to be built. I think it's about time. I mean, we have lived in our house since 1984, and we saw our first neighbor build a house that's much higher than what our neighbor now is proposing. And but then they toned it down because I think the original owner said that the house was done not properly. I guess he was an Italian guy, and he had to go to Italy because his father was ill. And then when he came back, the house was done, and he said it was not done right, and he take it down piece by piece. Anyway, but since then it has been just one thing after another. They never get it done. And it's very scary for us to live where we are now because of that empty lot, and the kids go up there. Even the 4th of July, just, the last 4th of July, all of a sudden in the middle of the night, we hear this big bomb, and it was in the middle of the night. And it was so scary, like somebody, terrorist is, have set off a bomb or something. And the kids were just in and out of there. It's impossible to stop them. One time they were trying to start a bonfire, and we call the police all the time, I tell you. So anyway, I think it's about time we see the house built. I would just love to have a nice neighbor rather than all these kids running in and out and creating all sort of terrible event. And it's like we witness that all the time. And it's very scary for us to live where we are. So I hope you help us out.
Thank you. Next we have Donald Van Buren. And after Donald, we'll have Avi Tepman.
Good evening. My name's Don Van Buren. I've resided at 21660 Rainbow Court, moving in late 1983. I support the applicant's proposal. We love the area. As it is now, the building site is an attractive nuisance. Probably 95% of the kids are good kids, but there's an element that gets up there that does the graffiti and the fireworks, and we've had some bonfires or bonfire attempts. So I think it's appropriate to get it developed, and I think it'll be a substantial improvement for the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you. Avi?
Good evening. I'm in the same school, really want this place to come. Our house is below. Their house is above, we are below, these guys are in between. So, and we are happy after all these hassles with all these kids and all those years, and they used to throw bottles in our house, like beer bottles or something like that. But we have one concern, that we had 2 years ago, over 2 years ago, we have a big blow of a drain pipe from this property. And then we have still yellow tag on our house because it broke 2 retaining walls and drew to the street tons and tons of dirt. And now the city wants us to rebuild that. And now we are suing the previous owner of this spot, but the reason, I need help here. So we approached our engineer, and he's telling us that this plan shows that they want to use the sewer easement and existing sewer lateral that caused the landslide. Be sure to oppose that option and express that a new route for the sewer lateral must be used because this location caused environmental damage in the form of landslide. So let me show where it is. Okay, this is overhead or not? Oh,
Yeah, we have it.
Yeah. I don't have a pen, I use my key. Let me see how it works. You see here, that's the new resident, and here, this is our property, and this goes, this is exactly what blew. So we must have this take this drain instead of going to our property to go to upland. Ask the commission, because we don't want again to have that. If there will be another big rain like was January 2017, we'll be the same place again. Then this is so I would like to actually cancel this easement and move this stuff somewhere else. It says over there, private 4-inch drain pipe. I don't know what private means, but. So I'm asked the commission to ask not to permit having this drain again. Thank you.
I didn't properly understand the last part. Does the city staff have any comments on that?
The public works conditions do discuss reviewing the drainage plans and whatnot, and I think our city engineer, now assistant director of public works, is aware of the issues. I think he received a call today regarding this easement issue, and during the building permit process, staff will review the drainage easement. We'll also review the drainage design and whatnot. So this project is conditioned that this would have adequate drainage design and whatever else.
We are allowed to bring public comment back, and if I want to look at this plan some more, we can do that. Okay. So would you please come back up and show us that plan? And
show you?
Yes. And have this explained a little bit better?
Yeah, maybe not.
Or perhaps if John could also help.
See this? Yeah, this is better. So, if you see here, this is the house and this is the drain. And it says here.
Can you speak in the I'll do it too. Can you speak in the microphone?
Connect new sanitary sewer.
Avi, could
Yes.
you speak into the microphone, please?
Oh. Okay, so I cannot show it here, only here, I guess.
You
Will
could turn the
s-
mic a bit.
Oh, okay, thank you. Sure. Thank you so much. So this is the proposed house, and this is the drain, and this is actually going on the east side of our house, 5 foot from the house, from the end of the house. If this is the house, the end of the house, it goes 5 foot there. And now it's all broken. And so we're asking to change the plan of this drain to go to, we propose to go to upland or somewhere else, because we don't want to be exposed again. We actually, as I said, we live now in a house that says yellow tag, and we don't want to get this again.
Okay, thank you. At this time, may we have the project engineer discuss?
Yeah, actually, I'm curious, can you just point at the approximate location of your house?
Our house, oh, here?
Yeah.
Sure. Our house is here. If this is the house, our house is here.
Okay, thank you.
This one. Okay. You need that?
Okay, let's go through all the public comments and then we can revisit. So I have 2 cards, one from Kathy Nicolino and another from Catherine Nicolino. Are they the same person or?
Yes, Catherine, I didn't realize she'd already given you a blue slip, and she had to leave at 10 o'clock. So she wrote this for me. I can give this to John.
Yeah, please.
But she asked me if I could read it out loud.
Okay.
On her behalf. She says that she and her husband have lived at 21640 Rainbow Court since October 1996. And in the 23 years they've lived there, the lot has been vacant. And she says it constitutes an attractive nuisance. People, often teenagers, hang out there, vandalize the property, etc. We see police cars heading up there to deal with this frequently. We'd love to see a home built on the property and have new neighbors living there. We encourage you to let the Barnas build on the lot as they desire. And I will pass this on. I believe there was also some other letters that were given to the commission. But
yes, they're part of the written record.
they are
so-
already, okay. But she wanted this read in, so.
Commissioner Moore, you wanted the engineer or the architect to come and talk about it?
Yes, if you could come up and explain. I also want to know how the ground is sloping. I can't tell exactly from this, from the diagram I was just shown. So if you have a...
Well, that diagram is still here, so if you want to turn it on, I can give you some information from this.
Okay.
So this is a grading and drainage plan prepared by the civil engineer for the project. And it shows the new driveway, a fire truck turnaround area, and it shows a new storm drain system being proposed that's been reviewed by Public Works. And Public Works has asked us to then run a pipe from the retention system, which collects all the water from the development, into a pipe that runs down to upland. So there already is a design submitted with this application that addresses the site drainage. However, the pipe that the gentleman is referring to is actually a sewer pipe. And what had happened when the original house got torn down, there was a sewer pipe from the old foundation. And every time it rained, the old foundation filled up with water, and it was going down the old sewer pipe, which it wasn't supposed to be doing. And that pipe was not designed for that volume of water. It was designed for a sewage pipe. So the pipe failed. And as part of Public Works condition, they're saying we need to repair the sewer pipe. But that is a legal easement for the sewer from this property to the sewer at Rainbow. So when it's repaired and it's used only as a sewer pipe, you won't have this issue again And the drainage design that has been prepared by the civil engineer shows that all the surface rainwater that created the problem will now go into an appropriate storm drain system that leads down to upland. And that hopefully answers that issue.
Okay, so looking at it's Rainbow Court, am I looking at a catch basin, which I've just put a red dot on?
Oh, you
I
just
did,
moved it.
just moved.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Try it again.
So yeah, so up here is where Rainbow Court ends.
Right.
And all of this is the emergency access road that the fire department has asked to be developed as part of this project.
Okay.
All of the water at Rainbow Court, there is actually a mound that's being designed. So the water from Rainbow Court can't go down the driveway. It actually will stay on Rainbow Court. Only the water that falls from the sky will go down. And at the very bottom of the emergency driveway, there is a catch basin to collect that water. There is also one at the fire truck turnaround to collect that water. And then all around the building are storm pipes from the roof that will collect the water, and they come around from the other end. And then you have a very large retention basin pipe detention system that all that water goes into during a storm. And then there's a regulating pipe that runs down to the catch basin on upland, which ties it into the storm drain system. So it's all a regulated system that will be installed, and that's what Public Works required of us in order to get clearance to be here tonight.
Okay. I was wondering if staff could double check the mounded area at the driveway entrance and verify that that is indeed a mound, because I have some questions about the topo lines showing there. So, right. And then, so we're looking at a catch basin. It looks like, I just put a dot on it. Let's not move the plan. So that looks like you've got a catch basin inlet there. I can't read the sizes of the pipes. Could someone start at beginning with the catch basin and then going down to the trench drain?
So I can't read them either at this scale, so John would need to pull up that drawing.
Because I read it already.
No, that's a different pipe over here, John.
No, this pipe is 4 inch.
Yeah, but this one up here is much larger.
This I don't know what it is.
Yeah, so that's the one that's collecting the rainwater.
Okay, so this, starting from the catch basin inlet, that's a 4-inch pipe?
No. No. John, I can't.
Yeah,
I'm hoping it's larger. That's just why I'm asking.
I don't have the access to the full-size drawings because all we have is electronic copies.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, coming back, I think for the topic at hand is about the hillside exception. I don't think this issue is especially pertinent to that. It's about an existing easement and how the sewage will flow. So I'm glad it is brought up here, but probably that's not something we need to focus on unless it affects CEQA or something else.
I think addressing the neighbor's concern and having an explanation that that the storm drain and the sewer are separated and that the problem is being resolved and appropriately, and that Public Works is looking into it is, probably in our best interest at this time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I also would agree with that. But I think this is civil engineering work. This is not planning commission work from the standpoint of sizing pipes and understanding what those requirements are. They're very technical, driven by area and rainfall and all of that. And so if staff can commit to just making sure and assessing drainage and that element, your staff are the experts at that. So that's my position.
Okay, I mean, because the thing is, anyway, if we can satisfy Commissioner Moore's curiosity about the size of the pipe, and do you have?
I do have I already have pulled up the zoomed in at the Rainbow Court terminus with the driveway right here, and it does look like there is some mounding from what I can tell. And again, I will agree with Commissioner Takahashi that I'm not a civil engineer, so I'm limited to design of the home and the limits of the FAR, the Residential Hillside Ordinance. But I can assure the commission that, you know, Public Works did condition this project that all on-site drainage and sewer functions would work properly and within any applicable code that's required. And, you know, we have a very capable Public Works staff that will hammer the applicant if they don't do the right thing, and I can assure you that much.
Right. The other element, I would assume that who's liable in the event that there is something not designed to spec for drainage? Just curious.
I think you have to look at the point of origin. Okay. You know, if the point of origin of the problem is on this property, my assumption, you know, it would be that it would be this property owner.
Right.
Yeah.
So did the sewer line need to be replaced after it failed? Did that already happen, or is it like an old, you know, VCP, vitrified clay pipe that the joints blew out? Like, what actually happened there?
The pipe that failed has not been used as a sewer pipe, obviously, in ever, because the house was never functioning as a home. So when it failed, the water that was collecting in the old foundation was coming out of the pipe. One of the conditions from the sewer department, separate from Public Works, we have a letter from sewer department that says that pipe either needs to have a new lining put in it or be completely replaced, and that's one of the conditions of approval from the City of Cupertino Sanitary District.
Okay.
So that is in the conditions of approval as well.
Okay, excellent. That's what I need to hear. Thank you.
All right.
So I'm just curious, the hillside exception in the process overall, this has had review from the Public Works.
Yeah. All departments, fire department, Public Works, sanitary. Yes.
Great, thank you.
All right. Do we have any more public comments? Okay. Does the commission have anything else to deliberate on?
I would just like to comment that for the letters that we received, they were all in favor of the project, and I have to say I am truly sorry for the nuisance which the neighbors have had to put up with for this property for so long, and I'm looking forward to it being resolved for you all.
All right. So I guess the recommended action is to find that the proposed actions are exempt per SEQA and approve the application per the draft resolution. Do we have somebody who's going to propose the motion?
I'm happy to if you want. See it.
Can I just add a real quick comment before?
Sure. Yeah. Sure.
So I guess I would just like to commend the applicant and owner for really doing a lot of homework, reaching out to all of the neighbors, because it obviously made this a no-brainer from the standpoint of really working in the community to make sure that that people understood what you were doing and that it was a benefit to the community. That's not always the case. I've definitely seen very contentious applications, whether it's a hillside application, so thank you.
Yeah. And I'll echo that as well. I actually happen to know one of your neighbors who was not contacted for this, and they were also positive to see something happen there. So, I think that the design, I actually misunderstood the intent of the 15 degree, but certainly in the spirit of what was trying to happen there, the design, really does stay very close to the ground. Should be great.
Cool. Okay, so let's go back to the motion. The recommended action is to find that the proposed action are exempt from SEQA and to approve the hillside exception.
Yes, see, are there numbers on this are there resolution numbers on this? I'm trying to.
Yeah, it's exclusion 2018-07.
The hillside exception might be a different number, or is it just this?
Just one resolution. EXC 2018-07.
You got to the.
It's a 2018-07.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, typically a CEQA exemption is part of the same resolution.
Okay,
Just
great,
yeah.
great. Okay, yeah, so I move we adopt EXC 2018-07.
Do we have a second?
And that we find that the proposed actions are exempt from CEQA.
I second it.
Okay, so we'll go for a vote. So the motion passes 4-0. Thank you, everybody. The next order of business is old business. City staff, do we have anything to cover in that area?
We have nothing on the agenda for old or new business.
Thank you. So no business is also taken care of. The staff and commission reports.
A number of the commissioners attended the dedication of the veranda. It was a fantastic, fantastic event and a fantastic project as well.
Yeah, it was nice to see something come along on. It looks pretty nice. Although I am wondering about why it costs $800,000 per unit. That's something for us to think about because there's
The reason is it's because it's very, very small. That was the only, result of a.
because you couldn't amortize the common costs.
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. Any other report?
Okay, so on July 30th, I attended the City of Cupertino's Lehigh Cement public meeting at the Quinlan Center. On August 1st, I chaired the Environmental Review Committee, and we had a CEQA overview educational presentation by Carmen Borg and Seth Petta of Shoot Mahaly and Weinberger, and we're hoping that we'll be able to bring that to the Planning Commission. August 7th, I attended the Cupertino Historical Society's Chinese Valentine's Day celebration. August 8th, I attended the Legislative Action Committee meeting of the Santa Clara County League of Cities to hear an update on the housing legislation and ABAG MTC. August 9th, I attended the Bicycle Pedestrian Commission meeting. August 10th, I attended the 10th Annual Kids Fun Festival and got to see the visiting students performing from Taiwan. And also on August 10th, I attended the Town Hall Forum led by Mayor Scharf and Councilmember Willie, which spent a good deal of time discussing housing. And then on August 12th, as already mentioned, I attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony at the Veranda, which is our city's new 19-unit affordable senior housing development.
On August 13th, you went and took pictures and talked to the neighbors for this agenda item. I guess if there's nothing else to do, I'm going to call for adjournment. Okay, thank you.